Hello and welcome to the Short Story Workshop. In each episode, we read a short story and then discuss it. This week's story is The Music of Erich Zann by H.P. Lovecraft. Matt, you picked this story. Can you tell us why you picked it?
I certainly can. It's Lovecraft again, but not as you know him. It's different this time, kind of. I picked this story because it's an interesting compromise. This is the story that non-Lovecraft fans can sometimes like. It's all of the good things about him with some of the bad things removed, I think. I think he kind of outdid himself with this one. So that's why I thought it was an interesting one to pick. Also, underrated within the fandom. Like, you see people talking about Lovecraft, they talk about The Shadow over Innsmouth, Mountains of Madness. I really like the music of Erich Zann. I don't see it talked about enough, so here we are.
Oh, that's an excellent explanation, and I really enjoyed this story as well. So here is The Music of Erich Zann by H.P. Lovecraft.
I have examined maps of the city with the greatest care, yet have never again found the Rue de Orsay. These maps have not been modern maps alone, for I know that names change. I have, on the contrary, delved deeply into all the antiquities of the place, and I have personally explored every region of whatever name which could possibly answer to the street I knew as the Rue de Orsay. But despite all I have done, it remains a humiliating fact that I cannot find the house, the street, or even the locality where, during the last months of my impoverished life as a student of metaphysics at the university, I heard the music of Erich Zann. That my memory is broken, I do not wonder, for my health, physical and mental, was gravely disturbed throughout the period of my residence in the Rue d'Orsay, and I recall that I took none of my few acquaintances there. But that I cannot find the place again is both singular and perplexing, for it was within a half-hour's walk of the university and was distinguished by peculiarities which could hardly be forgotten by anyone who had been there. I have never met a person who has seen the Rue d'Orsay. The Rue d'Orsay lay across a dark river bordered by precipitous brick blear-windowed warehouses and spanned by a ponderous bridge of dark stone. It was always shadowy along that river, as if the smoke of neighbouring factories shut out the sun perpetually. The river was also odorous with evil stenches which I have never smelled elsewhere, and which may some day help me to find it, since I should recognise them at once. Beyond the bridge were narrow cobbled streets with rails, and then came the ascent, at first gradual but incredibly steep as the Rue d'Orsay was reached. I have never seen another street as narrow and steep as the Rue d'Orsay. It was almost a cliff, closed to all vehicles, consisting in several places of flights of steps and ending at the top in a lofty ivied wall. Its paving was irregular, sometimes stone slabs, sometimes cobblestones, and sometimes bare earth with struggling greenish-grey vegetation. The houses were tall, peaked-roofed, incredibly old, and crazily leaning backward, forward, and sidewise. Occasionally an opposite pair, both leaning forward, almost met across the street like an arch, and certainly they kept most of the light from the ground below. There were a few overhead bridges from house to house across the street. The inhabitants of that street impressed me peculiarly. At first I thought it was because they were all silent and reticent, but later decided it was because they were all very old. I do not know how I came to live on such a street, but I was not myself when I moved there. I had been living in many poor places, always evicted for want of money, until at last I came upon that tottering house in the Rue d'Orsay, kept by the paralytic Blandot. It was the third house from the top of the street, and by far the tallest of them all. My room was on the 5th story, the only inhabited room there, since the house was almost empty. On the night I arrived, I heard strange music from the peaked garret overhead, and the next day asked old Blandot about it. He told me it was an old German viol player, a strange, dumb man who signed his name as Erich Zann and who played evenings in a cheap theatre orchestra, adding that Zann's desire to play in the night after his return from the theatre was the reason he had chosen this lofty and isolated garret room whose single gable window was the only point on the street from which one could look over the terminating wall at the declivity and panorama beyond. Thereafter I heard Zann every night, and although he kept me awake, I was haunted by the weirdness of his music. Knowing little of the art myself, I was yet certain that none of his harmonies had any relation to music I had heard before, and concluded that he was a composer of highly original genius. The longer I listened, the more I was fascinated, until after a week I resolved to make the old man's acquaintance. One night, as he was returning from his work, I intercepted Zann in the hallway and told him that I would like to know him and be with him when he played. He was a small, lean, bent person with shabby clothes, blue eyes, grotesque satyr-like face, and nearly bald head, and at my first words seemed both angered and frightened. My obvious friendliness, however, finally melted him, and he grudgingly motioned to me to follow him up the dark, creaking, and rickety attic stairs. His room, one of only two in the steeply pitched garret, was on the west side, toward the high wall that formed the upper end of the street. Its size was very great, and seemed the greater because of its extraordinary bareness and neglect. Of furniture, there was only a narrow iron bedstead, a dingy washstand, a small table, a large bookcase, an iron music rack, and 3 old-fashioned chairs. Sheets of music were piled in disorder about the floor. The walls were of bare boards and had probably never known plaster, whilst the abundance of dust and cobwebs made the place seem far more deserted than inhabited. Evidently, Erich Zann's world of beauty lay in some far cosmos of the imagination. Motioning me to sit down, the dumb man closed the door, turned the large wooden bolt, and lighted a candle to augment the one he had brought with him. He now removed his viol from its moth-eaten covering, and taking it, seated himself in the least uncomfortable of the chairs. He did not employ the music rack, but offering no choice, and playing from memory, enchanted me for over an hour with strains I have never heard before, strains which must have been of his own devising. To describe their exact nature is impossible for one unversed in music. They are a kind of fugue, with recurrent passages of the most captivating quality, but to me were notable for the absence of any of the weird notes I had overheard from my room below on other occasions. Those haunting notes I had remembered, and had often hummed and whistled inaccurately to myself, so when the player at length laid down his bow, I asked him if he would render some of them. As I began my request, the wrinkled, satyr-like face lost the bored placidity it had possessed during the playing, and seemed to shew the same curious mixture of anger and fright which I had noticed when first I accosted the old man. For a moment I was inclined to use persuasion, regarding rather lightly the whims of senility, and even tried to awaken my host's weirder mood by whistling a few of the strains to which I had listened the night before. But I did not pursue this course for more than a moment, for when the dumb musician recognised the whistled air, his face grew suddenly distorted with an expression wholly beyond analysis, and his long, cold, bony right hand reached out to stop my mouth and silence the crude imitation. As he did this, he further demonstrated his eccentricity by casting a startled glance toward the lone curtained window as if fearful of some intruder. A glance doubly absurd, since the garret stood high and inaccessible above all the adjacent roofs, this window being the only point on the steep street, as the concierge had told me, from which one could see over the wall at the summit. The old man's glance brought Blando's remark to my mind, and with a certain capriciousness I felt a wish to look out over the wide and dizzying panorama of moonlit roofs and city lights beyond the hilltop, which of all the dwellers in the Rue d'Orsay only this crabbed musician could see. I moved toward the window, and would have drawn aside the nondescript curtains, when with a frightened rage, even greater than before, the dumb lodger was upon me again, this time motioning with his head toward the door, as he nervously strove to drag me thither with both hands. Now thoroughly disgusted with my host, I ordered him to release me, and told him I would go at once. His clutch relaxed, and as he saw my disgust and offence, his own anger seemed to subside. He tightened his relaxing grip, but this time in a friendly manner, forcing me into a chair, then with an appearance of wistfulness crossing to the littered table where he wrote many words with a pencil in the laboured French of a foreigner. The note which he finally handed me was an appeal for tolerance and forgiveness. Zann said that he was old, lonely, and afflicted with strange fears and nervous disorders connected with his music, and with other things. He had enjoyed my listening to his music, and wished I would come again and not mind his eccentricities. But he could not play to another his weird harmonies, and could not bear hearing them from another, nor could he bear having anything in his room touched by another. He had not known until our hallway conversation that I could overhear his playing in my room, and now asked me if I would arrange with Blando to take a lower room, where I could not hear him in the night. He would, he wrote, defray the difference in rent. As I sat deciphering the execrable French, I felt more lenient toward the old man. He was a victim of physical and nervous suffering, as was I, and my metaphysical studies had taught me kindness. In the silence there came a slight sound from the window. The shutter must have rattled in the night wind, and for some reason I started almost as violently as did Erich Zann. So when I had finished reading, I shook my host by the hand and departed as a friend. The next day, Blando gave me a more expensive room on the 3rd floor, between the apartments of an aged moneylender and the room of a respectable upholsterer. There was no one on the 4th floor. It was not long before I found that Zann's eagerness for my company was not as great as it had seemed while he was persuading me to move down from the 5th story. He did not ask me to call on him, and when I did call, he appeared uneasy and played listlessly. This was always at night. In the day he slept and would admit no one. My liking for him did not grow, though the attic room and the weird music seemed to hold an odd fascination for me. I had a curious desire to look out of that window, over the wall and down the unseen slope at the glittering roofs and spires which must lie outspread there. Once I went up to the garret during theatre hours when Zann was away, but the door was locked. What I did succeed in doing was to overhear the nocturnal playing of the dumb old man. At first I would tiptoe up to my old 5th floor, then I grew bold enough to climb the last creaking staircase to the peaked garret. There in the narrow hall, outside the bolted door with the covered keyhole, I often heard sounds which filled me with an indefinable dread, the dread of vague wonder and brooding mystery. It was not that the sounds were hideous, for they were not, but that they held vibrations suggesting nothing on this globe of earth, and that at certain intervals they assumed a symphonic quality which I could hardly conceive as produced by one player. Certainly Erich Zann was a genius of wild power. As the weeks passed, the playing grew wilder, whilst the old musician acquired an increasing haggardness and furtiveness pitiful to behold. He now refused to admit me at any time, and shunned me whenever we met on the stairs. Then one night, as I listened at the door, I heard the shrieking viol swell into a chaotic babble of sound, a pandemonium which would have led me to doubt my own shaking sanity had there not come from behind that barred portal a piteous proof that the horror was real, the awful, inarticulate cry which only a mute can utter, and which rises only in moments of the most terrible fear or anguish. I knocked repeatedly at the door, but received no response. Afterward I waited in the black hallway, shivering with cold and fear, till I heard the poor musician's feeble effort to rise from the floor by the aid of a chair. Believing him just conscious after a fainting fit, I renewed my rapping, at the same time calling out my name reassuringly. I heard Zann stumble to the window and close both shutter and sash, then stumble to the door, which he falteringly unfastened to admit me. This time his delight at having me present was real, though his distorted face gleamed with relief, while he clutched at my coat as a child clutches at its mother's skirts. Shaking pathetically, the old man forced me into a chair, whilst he sank into another, beside which his viol and bow lay carelessly on the floor. He sat for some time inactive, nodding oddly, but having a paradoxical suggestion of intense and frightened listening. Subsequently, he seemed to be satisfied, and crossing to a chair by the table, wrote a brief note, handed it to me, and returned to the table, where he began to write rapidly and incessantly. The note implored me, in the name of mercy, and for the sake of my own curiosity, to wait where I was, while he prepared a full account in German of all the marvels and terrors which beset him. I waited, and the dumb man's pencil flew. It was perhaps an hour later, while I still waited, and while the old musician's feverishly written sheets still continued to pile up, that I saw Zann start as from the hint of a horrible shock. Unmistakably he was looking at the curtained window and listening shudderingly. Then I half fancied I heard a sound myself, though it was not a horrible sound, but rather an exquisitely low and infinitely distant musical note, suggesting a player in one of the neighbouring houses, or in some abode beyond the lofty wall over which I had never been able to look. Upon Zann the effect was terrible, for dropping his pencil suddenly he rose, seized his viol, and commenced to rend the night with the wildest playing I had ever heard from his bow, save when listening at the barred door. It would be useless to describe the playing of Erich Zann on that dreadful night. It was more horrible than anything I had ever overheard, because I could now see the expression of his face, and could realise that this time the motive was stark fear. He was trying to make a noise, to ward something off, or drown something out. What, I could not imagine, awesome though I felt it must be. The playing grew fantastic, delirious, and hysterical, yet kept to the last the qualities of supreme genius which I knew this strange old man possessed. I recognised the air. It was a wild Hungarian dance popular in the theatres, and I reflected for a moment that this was the first time I had ever heard Zann play the work of another composer. Louder and louder, wilder and wilder, mounted the shrieking and whining of that desperate viol. The player was dripping with an uncanny perspiration and twisted like a monkey, always looking frantically at the curtained window. In his frenzied strains, I could almost see shadowy satyrs and bacchanals dancing and whirling insanely through seething abysses of clouds and smoke and lightning. And then I thought I heard a shriller, steadier note that was not from the viol, a calm, deliberate, purposeful, mocking note from far away in the west. At this juncture, the shutter began to rattle in a howling night wind which had sprung up outside as if in answer to the mad playing within. Zann's screaming viol now outdid itself, emitting sounds I had never thought a viol could emit. The shutter rattled more loudly, unfastened, and commenced slamming against the window. Then the glass broke shiveringly under the persistent impacts, and the chill wind rushed in, making the candles sputter and rustling the sheets of paper on the table where Zann had begun to write out his horrible secret. I looked at Zann and saw that he was past conscious observation. His blue eyes were bulging, glassy, and sightless, and the frantic playing had become a blind, mechanical, unrecognisable orgy that no pen could even suggest. A sudden gust, stronger than the others, caught up the manuscript and bore it toward the window. I followed the flying sheets in desperation, but they were gone before I reached the demolished panes. Then I remembered my old wish to gaze from this window, the only window in the Rue d'Orsay from which one might see the slope beyond the wall and the city outspread beneath. It was very dark, but the city's lights always burned, and I expected to see them there amidst the rain and wind. Yet when I looked from that highest of all gable windows, looked while the candles sputtered and the insane viol howled with the night wind, I saw no city spread below, no friendly lights gleaming from remembered streets, but only the blackness of space illimitable, unimagined space, alive with motion and music and having no semblance to anything on earth. And as I stood there looking in terror, the wind blew out both the candles in that ancient peaked garret, leaving me in savage and impenetrable darkness, with chaos and pandemonium before me, and the demon madness of that night-baying viol behind me. I staggered back in the dark, without the means of striking a light, crashing against the table, overturning a chair, and finally groping my way to the place where the blackness screamed with shocking music. To save myself and Erich Zann, I could at least try, whatever the powers opposed to me. Once I thought some chill thing brushed me, and I screamed, but my scream could not be heard above that hideous viol. Suddenly out of the blackness, the madly soaring bow struck me, and I knew I was close to the player. I felt ahead, touched the back of Zann's chair, and then found and shook his shoulder in an effort to bring him to his senses. He did not respond, and still the viol shrieked on without slackening. I moved my hand to his head, whose mechanical nodding I was able to stop, and shouted in his ear that we must both flee from the unknown things of the night. But he neither answered me nor abated the frenzy of his unutterable music, while all through the garret strange currents of wind seemed to dance in the darkness and babel. When my hand touched his ear, I shuddered, though I knew not why till I felt of the still face, the ice-cold, stiffened, unbreathing face, whose glassy eyes bulged uselessly into the void. And then, by some miracle, finding the door and the large wooden bolt, I plunged wildly away from that glassy-eyed thing in the dark, and from the ghoulish howling of that accursed viol, whose fury increased even as I plunged. Leaping, floating, flying down those endless stairs through the dark house, racing mindlessly out into the narrow, steep and ancient street of steps and tottering houses, clattering down steps and over cobbles to the lower streets and the putrid, canyon-walled river, panting across the great dark bridge to the broader, healthier streets and boulevards we know. All these are terrible impressions that linger with me, and I recalled that there was no wind, and that the moon was out, and that all the lights of the city twinkled. Despite my most careful searches and investigations, I have never since been able to find the Rue d'Orsay, but I am not wholly sorry, either for this or for the loss in undreamable abysses of the closely written sheets which alone could have explained the music of Erich Zann.
I think what you said in the introduction is right. I can see how this story used a lot of the things Lovecraft was famous for, such as his creepy locations and unexplained monstrosities, but kind of, I don't know if grounded is the right word, but they felt a little bit more earthly than his usual stories. And I connected with it a bit more, and I loved the idea of this mysterious music luring the protagonist in and up to see what's going on and who's making the music and why. I thought that was a really good device. So yeah, I enjoyed the story. What did you think of it, Simone?
I mean, yeah, it's my favourite Lovecraft so far, possibly because it's less Lovecraftian than some of the others, even though it's still definitely Lovecraft. I'm a sucker for anything with the music trope, so that kind of appealed to me as a kind of concept in the premise. And I think it had some cool moments, cool imagery. Something about his writing I still find tricky, but like, yeah, no, good time.
Do you think it's maybe because he went all in on the setting first? It takes like a couple of, or like maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs before he gets into talking about the protagonist and his situation, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, because it doesn't feel entirely relevant to the story, except. So it's an interesting choice. It's like you've kind of had this idea like, oh, it's cool, imagine this place. But then, I mean, I suppose it does play in the sense of like the looking out the window setup, but slow to get started, and I think his writing can be quite dense. I'm a sucker for dialogue, and there's no dialogue, but you know, good time.
I think maybe what you're getting towards, I'm guessing, but one of the things that sometimes people criticize about his style is that it's very indirect. Like the perspective is quite distant. A lot of the information we get is told almost in summary, right? It's not here's what's happening directly in front of you like you're watching a movie. It's like, and then he wrote down a whole novel, right? It just summarizes a bunch of things.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's the distance.
Right.
Do you think maybe the distance makes it feel a bit dispassionate?
I think so, yeah. Like, so even when I like his ideas and think they're cool, I kind of can't get into the horror of the moment as much because he's quite distant in the way it's told. But, like, that's just an author's personal style thing, isn't it? Like,
yeah. I guess maybe what's missing is that he doesn't really focus on emotive writing or the emotions of the character as much.
It's not what he's interested
more about
in.
What's happening to them.
Which is, you know, it's fair enough if that's not what he's interested in writing about. Like, God knows I can't do setting like Lovecraft does. He's very good at it. But also, I love the emotion side of writing, so it's what I always automatically look for in stories.
Yeah, and I think we get we move towards that a bit more in this story near the end, where the account of what actually happens after this evil whatever is summoned and all the pages are snatched away, that stays in the moment for quite a long time, or longer than usual, I'd say.
Yeah, and we get a hint of the emotional impact with the characters still kind of looking for the place.
Yeah, that's true. It's similar in The Shadow over Innsmouth, because that story is a bit different from most, because, you know, the standard Lovecraft formula is there is a creepy thing over yonder. You go to yonder, you find the creepy thing, you run away screaming. That's the story. The thing Shadow over Innsmouth does differently is that the escape takes a while and is a lot more difficult. There's more conflict involved, and that makes it a bit more immediately engaging to me. And I think that's why it's one of his most popular stories.
I can see that.
So, going back to this story, do you think the music was summoning the monsters or repelling them? Because I wasn't quite sure how to read it. And I wondered if either of you had any concrete ideas about if it was both or neither, or I've not read it right and it's one or the other.
I first read it as repelling.
It's an interesting question.
Like, when I started
Yes,
it, I thought
so
it was
did I.
definitely repelling it because of, like, you know, his fear and whatever. But then by the time I got to the end, I wasn't as sure anymore.
Yeah, the more I thought about it, the less sure I got of this. Because if you look at what happens, it's like he hears some strange sound, then he starts playing. But then at the end, what happens is he dies, I guess, or is like possessed. But then he's still playing the music. I don't know. Like at first, it seems like, oh, he's heard some cue that this evil demon is going to show up. So he starts playing to like repel it or drown it out or something. But then the part where he seems possessed, or the fact that the music is still playing afterwards, almost implies that whatever this force is wants the music to be playing.
Yeah.
So that made me think maybe it was like possession, like this evil force has possessed him to play the music, which does the summoning.
Which explains why the music is so otherworldly. Sorry.
Yeah, that's the conclusion I came to as well.
There's an interesting part as well where when just before like the evil summoning stuff happens, he's like panicking and playing and panicking, and One thing that suggests he's possessed is like the weird movements that he does, by the way. He's described as like gyrating around all over the place, which suggests that he's struggling with it. And also that's like the only time he plays a song that the narrator recognizes. He's like, oh yeah, this is a Hungarian song. Almost like the Erich Zann is like protesting, like fighting against it, right? That's how it seems to me.
I like that idea.
Yeah, so the way I ended up reading it was, okay, so he was possessed by the monsters whose amazing plan was to get him to play the music that would open the void out of his window so they could then come into the world, or like maybe take the road out of the world. And then I started thinking, like, maybe I'm thinking about this too hard because it's not really confirmed. But that's kind of what I was thinking about along the lines.
It's not, but I think if you think about the story enough, that's the conclusion I reached as well. So maybe that is correct. But interestingly, it's not the conclusion you first come to, right?
No.
The most obvious answer is, oh, he's repelling whatever this thing is.
I wonder if there was supposed to be a reversal in the middle where you're supposed to think he's repelling and then it switches. You're not supposed to get that he's actually summoning.
Yeah, it's hard to know how much of this was intentional.
Or wild theory. The music originally starts keeping them away, but as the kind of creatures grow more used to the music, it stops having that effect. Like, you know that episode in Midnight with the repeating in Doctor Who? Like that, where it's a slow taking over. With the more he plays music, like, yes, it keeps them away, but then because like music is, I don't know, expression of your soul or something, opens him up to them, and therefore they can possess him.
Possible.
That's so creepy.
Unfortunately, I do not think Lovecraft. I don't think that was Lovecraft's idea, though, but it would have been cool.
It could have been. There is a sense that he was degrading as a person, this Erich, because every time the narrator sees him, he's like more withdrawn, looks moodier. Like some change is clearly happening.
I got a bit confused about the way they were communicating. Is it right that because Erich Zann is not a French speaker, he was trying to write down his thoughts in French so that our narrator would understand them?
He's a
rather than
mute,
trying to
isn't he?
speak them in French.
He's a
Is he
mute.
mute?
He can't talk.
Yeah, he's mute.
Oh, I don't know how.
That's why he's referred to as dumb several times. It's not just the narrator being really mean.
Oh, I thought he was just like this stupid guy playing this music, keeping me up all night.
No, it seems like he either can't speak or won't speak or something like that.
That makes the fact that he plays music just somehow make more sense to me.
It does. It's cool.
All right, what did you think that Zann was writing as his explanation? I suppose we kind of touched on it in the answer to the last question, but I suppose we could look at it from, do you think Zann was aware of what was happening to him? Or how much do we think he knew?
God, it's such an interesting part of the story to structure it around, to be like, hey, here's the answer, and then like take it away from the reader right in front of them.
Literally blown out the
It's
window.
And then-
evil. It's so evil.
I love as well that it's mentioned in the last paragraph, because the narrator's like, I'm not sure I even want to know what he wrote. And you're like, really?
No, I want to know.
Yeah.
I like that that's addressed directly. It's like Lovecraft is saying, like, this isn't the point. Like, you know, the answer was there. You don't have it. The point isn't, like, I don't know. Maybe what he's actually saying is this is more powerful without the answer or something like this.
See, I got the impression that the answer was almost stolen by the creatures out the window, because they kind of took it, didn't they? So,
Yeah,
which
you
case,
could read it that way.
it's not that you're more powerful not knowing, it's that they want to take that power with all the things that you can't understand or express. Because silence, obviously, being able to communicate something gives you a certain power, and increasingly that power is taken away from Zann throughout the story. So it kind of makes sense that his
That's true.
explanation was also ripped away from him, and that he's just got no control to communicate by the end because he's, dead and still playing, which was a wonderful image.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. I like as well that he wrote so much, right? He couldn't just write, hey, so, I've been possessed by this dark spirit. He had to write, like, a whole novelization.
You could have just said, monsters, help. Like, it's your own fault for being so wordy. I wonder if Lovecraft was imagining, like, oh yeah, if I have to call for help, I'll just, like, be so busy trying to find the right words that the burglars will just stab me in the time it takes.
He's probably like one of those people who writes me like, I don't know, like 2 sides of A4 to tell me they can't access their emails.
He definitely would. No, but I mean, it makes you feel like it was something quite complicated, right? Like, it must have been quite the ordeal this guy's gone through. I imagine it must have been something like, I moved here and then this really weird thing started happening. I don't know. When you try and put it down and like guess based on Lovecraft's other stories, it sounds like really obvious, I suppose. But
I wondered if he might have been writing about the other lodger who might have potentially stayed in the same place the narrator did, because he's pretty determined that the narrator should like move down a floor, right? And I wondered if there was a story behind that.
Trying to protect him.
That's a really good idea. Yeah, that could be true.
That is a good point.
So he could have been writing this horror epic about what happened to his last neighbour who came in while he was playing the viola, I don't know, and being like, stay the heck away. But
possible.
Sadly, we'll never know.
I wonder what would have been an interesting take on this story is if the narrator managed to get hold of one page.
That would have been cool.
And then you are given like that page verbatim, right? And maybe it could tell you some things, but not the whole story. That would have been really interesting.
That would have been a good kind of key mechanism.
You could kind of fill the gaps in for yourself.
And it would almost feel more plausible than the whole thing going out the window because you can't even catch one of them.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, how convenient.
Monsters.
I think there's a lot you could do with that because it becomes a really difficult task then as a writer to be like, what do I put in this one page, right?
I mean, of course, that's assuming Lovecraft even knew.
I mean, I suspect that he didn't.
Exactly. A good way to get around the fact that you can't think up an ending. It's fine. Everything is unknowable. I don't need to explain my monsters. They're beyond you all.
I think if you would like forced him to write the explanation, it would have come out just like any other of his stories, you know.
Yeah, and the fact that this one, I think one of the things that makes this one different is he doesn't really explain the monsters at all. Whereas in his other stories, he goes into quite a lot of detail about where they came from, what they look like, what they'll do to you.
What they've been doing. I mean, I mentioned The Shadow over Innsmouth earlier. That story begins with like 10 pages of this one sailor talking, where you're basically just ranting about how these sea creatures exist in this town, and it's just so stupid. There's way too much exposition.
Yeah, much exposition. So I guess that leads nicely to my next question, which is the blank abyss out of the window scarier than a hellscape crawling with highly detailed monsters? What do you think?
Depends. I mean, if you're gonna detail some monster, it better be good. You better like hit us with quite a strong image, right? That kind of defines the story. I think if you're not going to do that, nothing is your next best bet. And honestly, seeing darkness fits Lovecraft's themes so much better that I think it was the right call.
Yeah, your other option is doing a fragment of what it is, like an eye or a tooth or a shadow moving or something. Vague enough, but you can still see the effects of the thing.
Yeah, you could, but I really think if you're going to like detail something, it would better be good, right?
I mean, yeah, if you're going to do highly detailed
you can't
monsters.
half-ass that.
I feel like the only highly detailed monsters that almost work are A, when it's not meant to be horror, or B, when they're humanoid and the highly detail is more in their actions, behaviour and dialogue, personally. It almost doesn't work for sci-fi monsters. Alien franchise is currently pointing a trigger at my face going, take that back, but anyway.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree. It depends. Like, there's only a certain amount of complexity that we can picture in our heads, right? So I think you just need to be smart about how you describe it. If you can like relate it to creatures we know and avoid it getting like super complicated, I think it can work well.
Yeah, I guess. I suppose it also depends if what it looks like is relevant to the story.
Yeah, I mean, if the creature is your villain, then usually what it looks like will relate to how you're going to fight it, I suppose.
Yeah, also it can give you some idea of why it behaves the way it does. If you know roughly what creature it's based on or roughly what it looks like. Okay, something with big sharp teeth is probably hungry because it's a carnivore. You know, it's basic, but stuff like that can tell a lot.
Think of Beyond Lies the Wub. I believe the wub was described as kind of like a big slobbery pig.
Yeah, Yeah,
which
that sounds about
fits
right.
its role in the story, right? Because they ultimately like debate whether to eat it or not.
I also think the word, while it's a form of horror, the horror isn't what the monster is in the sense of the physical.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, I think the second that it's like the shark turning up in Jaws, basically. Like, it's so much scarier before the shark actually turns up, or you just see the fin. And this is someone who's scared of sharks. I know, I think the second we can see something, we can find something in it to humanize it, or understand it, or look for a way to defeat it.
Right. You kind of know where you stand. It's what you were talking about earlier about like knowledge
Yeah.
giving you power.
I've got to say, for me, there's nothing scarier than nothing. Just a big, empty maw full of things you can't quite see is a horrifying image to me.
Right, and that's Lovecraft all over, right? It's like there's something here, but you lack you humble human. You lack the senses to perceive it, right?
Yeah, I'm a humble human.
I mean, I'd rather not see it if it's a big spider.
Oh, I agree. I really hate spiders. I remember editing one of these episodes where there was a spider on my window and I could just hear the terror in my voice. Maybe spiders are scarier than a blank abyss.
Yeah, they are.
No, I'm not sure. Okay, so as we talked about earlier, this is a bit different to a lot of H.P. Lovecraft stories, and when I checked it out, he in fact considered this to be one of his best stories. Out of what we read, do we agree with that? And Matt, you have read way more than me and Simone, so...
First of all, did you see his reason for saying it was one of his best?
He said that it didn't have some of the flaws that were prevalent in his other stories or something like that.
Yeah, specifically he said it doesn't have the over-explicitness of his other work, which I thought was an interesting phrase.
An interesting phrase.
I think maybe one of the criticisms of a lot of Lovecraft stories is that they're not explicit, like, at all. So I don't really know what he meant. Maybe it was just a different way of saying what I think he means is that it doesn't have a lot of the like exposition, like rambling about background, which is true for sure. Like this story is very efficient by his standards.
I expected to have like a history of the street or like a, I don't know, like a, more exposition, judging by his other stories.
I also feel like, at least from the ones limited amount I've read, this story feels more about humans than some of his other stories, which are all about the creepy sci-fi thing. This one kind of feels more about how humans react to the creepy sci-fi thing, with the whole focus on the music, which is such a human thing to do.
Yeah, and the fact that our conduit is Mr. Erich Zann.
Like, it's isolation and trying to reach someone and, like, being scared of what's out there in the dark. Those are all incredibly universal human experiences.
Also the bit where our protagonist is like, I do what I want, and goes to listen to the music anyway.
Yeah.
Such a protagonist thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, the narrator, he shows agency, which is very sparingly distributed in Lovecraft stories. It's one of my pet peeves.
I mean, yeah, it's one thing, like, you're dealing with a god that you can possibly fight anything against. But if you've ever met humans, they'll still try.
Oh, yeah. I'll go sharpen this twig. Try my shot against the monster.
Yeah.
I've got to say this is my favourite Lovecraft story that I've read, which is a very popular opinion, according to Wikipedia. But, yeah, I think because of the reasons that we just outlined.
Yeah, according to noted weird fiction writer Ramsey Campbell, this is the only Lovecraft story that Robert Eichmann liked. Robert, also a strange fiction author. So at least one well-known literary figure. This was the only Lovecraft story he could tolerate.
Wow, that's quite the accolade.
It was anthologized quite a lot as well, so it is popular.
It's a lot more accessible, isn't it?
It is. I think it's one of the best in terms of not having Lovecraft's weaknesses, and I think it still manages to get across a lot of what makes Lovecraft good. So I think it is one of the best. But I think it should be noted that the Lovecraft fans, they're not that keen on it. Like it's not one of the ones that comes up all the time. Exactly. It's less
like if
Lovecraft
you're going to be
than a lot of
obsessed with his
Lovecraft
weirdness,
stories.
like.
Oh, I see. I suppose it makes sense.
So I think it depends on your or perspective as always, but I think it's one of his best. I think technically it's one of his best. The diehard fans may disagree.
Cool. Okay, so this story, I say briefly, uses the trope which is on TV tropes as the little shop that wasn't there yesterday. So that describes a location where the character was there, but now they can't find it. So in this story, it's Rue d'Orsay, where this house is, and it's described quite well at the beginning as having all these leaning houses that sometimes even touch each other. It sounds like a very dangerous place to live, to be honest.
I love it as a setting. It's so well described as well.
It is a very good setting.
It's very interesting. So the very first story we did on this podcast, The Magic Shop, was all about one of these. A shop that the main character goes to and then can't find ever again. After
that was The Magic Shop, right?
Magic Shop by H.G. Wells, yeah. This was apparently a very popular trope around the time H.G. Wells was writing as well.
Yeah. Around the period this story was written as well, like the early 20th century.
Yeah.
I think it was probably when this was most popular.
But I think it's still popular today, although now I've said that, the examples I was sure I thought of have just flown out my head.
Yeah. It's surprisingly difficult to think of some.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm sure Inside Number 9 must have done this. And I looked through the episodes and I was like, no, I don't think they have.
Well, maybe they should. It's kind of a shame.
They should. I think Stephen King likes this trope. Although, well, in The Dark Tower, there's the Manhattan Restaurant of the Mind, which is a bookshop, even though it's called a restaurant. I think that kind of fits this because it's kind of a mystical, very important location to the plot, but it's very hard to get to. They do end up going there multiple times, but it's very hard to get to because it exists solely in 70s New York, which means you need to time travel to get there, basically. So maybe that counts? Yeah.
I think it counts. It sounds like it counts to me. I guess
literally it wasn't there yesterday or the day before, but it was there 30 years ago.
Because you never know what time you're in. I just like it because it feels like a great excuse to put something mystical up against something that you see or know very well, maybe somewhere you've been every day. And the fact that it disappears means there's some doubt cast over your narrator, whether it really happened or not, which I know is kind of an overdone trope, but I still like it.
I mean, also, if they need to get there urgently to get something, then they can't for plot reasons, because it's literally not there when they need it, which can add an interesting bit of tension.
Yeah, terrifying.
Doctor Who uses this trope in Face the Raven, one of its more recent episodes, but not like super recent, like 12 Doctor.
Yes, I remember it. I was trying to think of any more, but no, I'm sorry, I'm lost. I'm done.
I mean, it's parallel to a lot of other tropes, isn't there? Like portals, basically, or ins between worlds and that kind of thing.
Do you like me some magical locations?
Yeah.
Maybe I should write a story based on one of these. I think it would be fun.
Yeah, how to cope with living in a house that's only sometimes there.
Trixie.
It's the Room of Requirement, right? Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Although that one's more it's there if you have need of it, but basically it's always in the same spot, so you can pretty reliably find it once you know where it is, basically. And so long as you kind of know
Every
the
time
path
I think of an example, there's a caveat.
In all fairness, in this story, it could have just been that the street was demolished as, like, a housing violation or something.
It does sound pretty unsafe.
They just fell down. Yeah, maybe. It doesn't sound like a great place to live, really. I don't know how I'd feel about my house just leaning over that much. It doesn't seem safe. Even if the rent was cheap, I
don't know, for all we know, none of the plot actually happened. He just got asbestos poisoning or something from living in a bad house. Hallucinated the whole thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for listening. Please leave a comment on our website, shortstoryworkshop.com, to let us know what you thought. You can also find all our previous short stories and episodes. We'll be back with another story in 2 weeks. Goodbye.